So I thought I'd do something a little bit different today, and it's do a tag video, which I have not done a tag in forever. But I didn't want to go back and do a lot of the ones that I've done before because that felt a little cheap. So I actually just found a new-ish one, maybe, kind of, sort of. The name of which was created by Steph Bower. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. It's this one. This is a book recommendation tag, so I figured, why not get back into the swing of things by recommending some books to you all, the audience, based on my preferences and whatever else the prompts tell me. I prepared for this. Let's do it. All right, so number one, a book that you tell people is your favorite. So it's hard for me to typically narrow down a favorite book. It's usually based on genre. For me, I like to recommend series, not necessarily a single book, and that's usually because I read a lot of series and I don't read a lot of standalones. Having said that, the first one that comes to mind is Dune, which is my favorite sci-fi book of all time. I've read it annually for the last couple of years, and this is because Dune I constantly come back to time and time again, and I'm not a rereader of books, so that should tell you a lot of my feelings about the book Dune, because I keep coming back to it and it's always fun to read. I always love rediscovering things about it. And even though I've gone through and reread Red Rising, I've reread the Dresden Files, a lot of these books just don't stick to me as well as Dune does. So I'd probably say right now my favorite book is Dune. Now, having rambled about sci-fi real quick, the obvious one for me for fantasy is A Storm of Swords by George R.R. Martin, book 3 of A Song of Ice and Fire, because that book is incredible and quite possibly the best fantasy book ever written. So that also on a reread, I had forgotten how much actually happens in that book, and holy shit, that is chock full of top 10 best moments of the series. I mean, it's just like every single big epic moment that happens in that book is a 10 out of 10. It's shenanigans. It's insane. A book that is my guilty pleasure. I mean, I'm not really ashamed of anything that I've read. There's nothing here that I'm like, oh, I know it's trash, but I love it because I just read awesome shit. 3, a book that everyone loved, but I didn't. Haha, I've talked about this crap before. That would be Empire of the Vampire by Jay Kristoff. I know that upsets a lot of you out there in the YouTube world and Goodreads and just booktube people in general. People that like books. Book readers. Yeah. Vampire lovers amongst you. Empire of the Vampire is unfortunately garbage. I made it about 300 pages into that book before I finally gave up entirely. And that was during a buddy read with Leanna, who still scolds me to this day for quitting on her by not finishing the book. We laugh about that book probably every week or two just because of how crappy it was. I just constantly be told, I'm just constantly told by people that it's super Aussie and that's where all the swearing and humor comes from. I love swearing. Swearing doesn't bother me. It bothered me in that book because it felt super unnecessary, as if a child just learned the word fuck. And the humor was just not funny. The characters were unlikable. The story was uninteresting. The weird sexual things that Jay Kristoff likes to do was unsettling, and it just was not the book for me. I hated it. A book I read the fastest. So again, single book. It was probably one of the Dresden File books because I got into a groove with those where I was reading one a day almost, and that's really fast for me. Even though it's only a couple hundred pages, those books fly by at a rapid pace. They're action-packed, nonstop. Probably one of the Red Rising books I'd say was pretty similar. They're also not super long, so Golden Sun I probably read very quickly, but it's definitely the Dresden Files. Some of those books I absolutely devoured and probably started another one in that same day, so I don't remember offhand which one was the fastest, but they were all pretty quick. Even when they get bigger, they don't last very long. I go through them fast. So the next one is a book that I think deserves more hype. So I'll say The Forgetting Moon by Brian Lee Durfee, but honestly just his trilogy in general. I still need to finish it and read The Lonesome Crown, but by the time that The Blackest Heart had come out, and this is his 5 Warrior Angels series, I feel like there weren't a lot of people talking about it. And if you go to Goodreads and you look up like any Sarah J. Maas book, and there's hundreds of thousands of reviews for it, you go to Durfee's, and these are really well-written, big, thick, full of lore, epic fantasies. It just doesn't get the love that I think it deserves, and I feel like more recently it's getting more traction, But man, go read this man's books. If you love big epic fantasy with deep in-depth characters and world building, you got to check out The Forgetting Moon and see if you like it. If you do, the rest is gravy. A book that is becoming a movie or TV show. It seems like everything is getting adaptations these days, and a lot of them are terrible. I have not read the Witcher series, so the show is not offensive to me, but it's clearly not as good as even the first season was, and I know book readers hate it. We all saw what happened with The Ring of Power. I think that's just like atrociously written and directed, basically every single episode. So a lot of this shit scares me. Like A Song of Ice and Fire was a fantastic adaptation for most of it, and then it went downhill. But I mean, to get 5 solid seasons out of a show, like that's pretty hard to do. I believe there's going to be some Sanderson stuff in the works. I know Red Rising has gone back and forth. I know they were talking about doing the Greenbone Saga. I don't even know if half this stuff is still being talked about anymore. I would just say Red Rising. Now, I don't know if and when that's going to happen. I know there was talks of it years ago happening, and it ended up not going through because I hope, and it seems like Pierce Brown is smart enough to not just hand over the rights to his love and soul of his series and watch Ring of Power happen to it. So I think he's waiting for the right match, but I'm really hoping and looking forward to that being adapted. I don't know if they're going to do a movie or TV show, but either way, if it gets a budget behind it and you do it properly, it could be so awesome. So I really hope that actually still gets made. So that's what I would recommend, is read the Red Rising series, because whether it gets adapted or not, it's fucking awesome. But if you like a sci-fi fantasy blend with tons of action and awesome characters and twists and turns like none other, read the Red Rising series because it's fantastic. So a book that I've reread the most, this is kind of cheating because I already talked about it, Dune. It's the only book that I've reread more than 3 times, I think. And I'm probably just going to make that an annual reread at this point because I love it. So I'm not going to talk about Dune anymore because it's fantastic. And I already talked about it. So a book from a genre that I don't typically read. Now, I basically, when I'm reading for leisure or just, in my spare time, it's almost always fantasy or sci-fi. So I don't read a lot outside of that unless you're going to talk about D&D books. But I mean, that's fantasy, right? Like it's literally Dungeons and Dragons. So I'm going to go with a historical fiction series, which kind of bleeds into fantasy a little bit, but Bernard Cornwell's The Saxon Tales, because I absolutely adore his writing. His character work is fantastic, and the way that he mixes in fictitious characters into real life things that happened in history is brilliant. His dialogue is great. His action is great. His politicking is very real feeling. And of course, the show kicks ass too. So if I was going to recommend a show that is actually good, that's already based on books that are also good, watch The Last Kingdom, because it's awesome. So the next one is a book that deserves all of the hype that it gets. I'm going to go with The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. Now, I know this is an unfinished series. I don't think it's ever going to be finished. Who knows? But I have a review of this on my channel. I absolutely adore this book. It's hilarious. It's gripping. It's action-focused, almost like a heist in a way. It's just wonderfully written, and it operates perfectly as a standalone. So even though this is a series, you don't need to read on beyond that. If all you want is The Lies of Locke Lamora, it is a fantastic standalone book. I recommend this to anybody that likes fantasy tales, and it's pretty low fantasy too. There's not a ton of magic and wizards and stuff like that. It's very grounded for the most part, and actually gets incredibly violent at some points, which I was not expecting. But honestly, you read this book for Locke and John because their character dynamic and interactions are just brilliant. And I think this would be something that, if you want another thing that could be adapted, much like Pirates of the Caribbean, like that's kind of what it reminds me of with the mix of action and humor. That style, I think, would fit this really well. And The Lies of Locke Lamora is fantastic. Anybody that tells you otherwise is wrong. So the next one is a book you usually recommend when asked to give a recommendation. I'm the annoying person that takes that prompt from a person, and I'm just like, well, what are you interested in? Are you reading fantasy? Are you reading sci-fi? Do you want urban fantasy? Do you want low fantasy? Do you want high epic fantasy? Do you want like a dungeon crawl? What do you want? What do you want? So a book that has my favorite characters. Again, I'm going to cop out and go with series because a single book doesn't stick with me as much as the series and how characters grow throughout the series. So for science fiction, and this is kind of cheating because it blends with fantasy, but Red Rising, again, has some of my favorite characters that I've read. I love them. I'm not going to mention too many by name because I don't want to spoil anything, but just that series between Darrow as the main character, the other POV characters that you get to, follow in the sequel quartet now that it is going to be, and most of the side characters and just his entire party that he's around for the most part, his interactions with all of them are great, and they're wonderfully written, and they're all kind of psychos in their own way, but I love them very, very much. I would have to also give a nod of the cap to Joe Abercrombie with First Law, because those characters are incredibly unique and distinct, and Glocta being one of the ones that pops in my mind as a favorite to read about. And of course, Stephen Pacey, brilliant narrator of that character. If you are into audiobooks, First Law, Stephen Pacey, chef's kiss. And of course, A Song of Ice and Fire. I mean, A Song of Ice and Fire has created some of the greatest fantasy characters, in my opinion, ever that the genre has seen. And it's hard to top that. I mean, Tyrion Lannister, Tywin, Cersei, Jaime, Ned Stark. I mean, just all of these characters that we follow are so unique and have a voice that shines through in their chapters in every single book. It's not one of those writers where you run into the problem where a lot of characters start to sound the same, if that makes sense. George R. R. Martin is incredibly distinct in how he writes those characters, and I love that about his work. I just gave a bunch of different answers, and I didn't even say a single book. I was just talking about a bunch of shit. A book I wish I could live in. I read a lot of medieval fantasy with crazy people that want to destroy the world and super interesting but creepy sci-fi. I'd probably be terrified to live in any of these places. So I'm going to say somewhere in Discworld because it's at least fun. But no, seriously, save me. If I'm in any of these worlds, I'm terrified. Next up, a book I thought I would hate but ended up loving. Now, I wouldn't go as far as to say I loved it, but Tress of the Emerald Sea, I absolutely thought I was going to hate based on everything that I was hearing about how it was written, certain things that were in the book, and just its focus. I don't like boat tales. I don't like seafaring adventures typically in books. And I heard it was geared toward a younger audience, and Sanders was trying to be funny, and all the things that I was not excited about, I actually ended up really, really enjoying about the book, and I thought it was fantastic. I have a review up on my channel for it. I'll link up above. It was honestly just a lot of fun. It was whimsical. It was totally different than what I'm used to reading from him, and I think he did a very good job on the type of book that he wrote, and it has me interested in reading the other secret projects of him that I have sitting up here on the shelf that you can maybe see. The Frugal Wizard and the Painter right there. Hey, you can't really see it. So the next one is a book that made me cry, because I don't typically cry reading books. Like I definitely do for movies and music, especially. I'd say Pet Sematary got me pretty close because of the nature of the plot and what it revolves around. And honestly, being a father made me a big old softie. So whenever there's something happening with a kid in a book, news, story, song, movie, that hits me directly in the heart. And it wasn't even necessarily like the scene in Pet Sematary definitely was hard, but it's even more so than that with Stephen King in the foreword of the book talking about his inspiration for why he wrote Pet Sematary scared the shit out of me, because as a dad, you get terrified of your kids essentially trying to kill themselves on a regular basis because they don't know any better. So when you're dealing with a child potentially running into a street and getting hit by a car, that is just a horrifying thing to think about as a parent. So reading that as Stephen King and not as the writer, just him telling a story about something that happened that caused him to write that book, that made me cry. So Pet Sematary. I hope you're all sad now. And finally, a book that I wish I could read for the first time again. You know what? I thought about this and I decided to go with Guards by Terry Pratchett, because the man is a genius, and most books don't make me laugh as freaking hard as a Terry Pratchett book. And my God, Guards, when I first read that, I laughed out loud several times at just the ridiculous premise and characters. And just how intelligently he writes comedy and the situations that he puts characters in is so absurd and ridiculous at times that it's outright hilarious. And I laughed so much in that book. I wish I could experience that again. I mean, there's tons of books that could be the answer for this. You know, A Game of Thrones comes to mind because that was just like a holy shit, this is awesome and epic kind of feeling. Fellowship of the Ring, that first reading, incredible. The Hobbit, again, I mean, shit, when I read Empire of Silence, I was blown away by how well Rocchio was writing and world building. When I read Assassin's Apprentice, hey, that book also made me cry because damn, Robin Hobb, you are mean to your characters. Leave him alone, please. Fitz is a good boy. It's amazing how poorly these batteries hold their charge after I've charged them because this is my third battery in this video and it's not that long. So I answered with several books again because I'm terrible at prompts and I don't like giving one answer. So I gave several answers. So if you're watching this, consider yourself tagged. If you want to answer these in Discord, in the comments down below, or in your own video, please feel free to do so. Tag me if you want to. Again, the original video will be posted down below with the name of the lady that just created it. What is her name? Hold please. Steph. Hi Steph. Thanks for making this. So yeah, that's it for me guys. Until next time.